In the medieval world, marriage was rarely a private matter for the elite. For noblewomen, it was more often a diplomatic instrument, a transfer of alliances, land claims, hostageship, and legitimacy wrapped inside a ceremony that could appear ceremonial from the outside and coercive at its core. Cross empires from Western Europe to Byzantium, from the Islamic polities of the Eastern Mediterranean to the courtly societies of Central and East Asia, highborn women were frequently placed at the intersection of family strategy and statecraft. Historical records indicate that the terms of their marriages could determine border policy, succession claims, tribute arrangements, and peace settlements. When a woman was compelled into a political marriage, the punishment was not always a single public act. More often, it was a prolonged condition of surveillance, reproductive pressure, and limited autonomy enforced by law, kinship, and court custom. Contemporary accounts describe noble marriage as one of the central mechanisms by which medieval rulers extended power beyond the immediate reach of armies. A marriage alliance could bind two dynasties more effectively than a treaty, because it tied the honor of families to the continuation of a bloodline. Yet this same system made women vulnerable to being treated as movable assets. Surviving documents suggest that consent, where it appears in legal language, was often understood through the needs of the family, rather than the wishes of the bride. Ecclesiastical law in Latin Christendom formally required consent, but legal practice could be shaped by coercion, expectation, and the pressure of kin. A noblewoman might be asked to speak agreement while surrounded by men who had already negotiated every meaningful detail of her future. Punishment for refusal varied, but it was rarely neutral. In some cases, noble women who resisted a politically advantageous match were confined, pressured by relatives, or sent to religious houses until compliance became the only viable path. Chroniclers noted that noble women who disobeyed dynastic strategies could be stripped of inheritance, isolated from political access, or denounced as threats to public order. Because marriage was tied to legitimacy, refusal could be framed not as a personal decision, but as an act against the state. A woman's body became a site on which power asserted itself. Once married, the penalties often continued in quieter forms: abandonment in a foreign court, loss of natal support, or the burden of producing heirs under intense scrutiny. Byzantine imperial politics reveal this dynamic with unusual clarity. Marriage that was deeply connected to rank, ceremony, and imperial ideology. Imperial brides, especially those brought into the dynasty from outside established elite circles, could be elevated quickly and then isolated just as quickly if they failed to secure political confidence. Court expected the empress to represent continuity, fertility, and sanctity. When a marriage became politically inconvenient, imperial strategy could shift around the woman with little regard for her security. Surviving chronicles and court narratives show that women in dynastic unions were often judged not only by loyalty, but by whether they produced sons and whether those sons survived. The empress was not merely a spouse. She was an instrument of succession, and her value could be reduced if she did not fulfill that role. In Western Europe, noblewomen were similarly embedded in inheritance politics. Marriages among ruling houses often determined the fate of counties, duchies, and claims to thrones. The woman's marriage portion, dowry and dower, was supposed to provide some protection, but these arrangements did not guarantee freedom. Legal codes of the period reveal that women's marital rights were often mediated through male guardians, and enforcement depended on the balance of family power. If a daughter was useful as a bargaining chip, resistance could be met with confinement or with the threat of disinheritance. If a marriage generated political advantage, then the woman's consent became a formality more than a real choice. The consequences could be lifelong. A foreign bride might be cut off from her natal network, expected to speak a new language, observe a new court culture, and endure suspicion from those around her. Her marriage could secure peace on paper while producing a kind of internal exile. The same pattern appears across frontier societies where diplomacy and warfare overlapped. In many medieval empires, especially where tribute, vassalage, and hostage exchange shaped relations, elite women were sometimes moved between courts as part of negotiated submission. These women could function as symbols that a defeated or subordinate power had accepted the authority of another ruler. When the political order changed, the woman's position changed with it. If her husband fell from favor, or if alliances shifted, she might be repudiated, remarried, or relegated to a secondary household. The punishment was often administrative rather than theatrical. Her social world narrowed, her access to kin reduced, her children claimed by rival factions, and her role redefined by men who did not need to ask what she preferred. In the Islamic world of the medieval period, marriage among elite families also served diplomacy, inheritance, and alliance building, though the legal and social frameworks differed across regions and dynasties. Elite women could possess property rights and contractual protections more explicit than in some neighboring systems, yet political marriages still remained instruments of power. A woman married into a ruling household might gain status, but she could also become vulnerable if the alliance faltered. Court historians and legal records alike indicate that elite women's marriages were closely watched because they linked household stability to political order. A marriage could elevate a family's prestige, but it could also become a means of control over an ambitious clan or a defeated rival. The woman herself remained central to the arrangement, but not always central to the decision. What made these marriages punitive was not only force at the moment of betrothal, it was the structure that followed. Noblewomen in political marriages were frequently expected to produce heirs, administer households, host petitioners, preserve diplomatic etiquette, and remain visible enough to represent the alliance but constrained enough not to threaten it. Their daily lives were shaped by repeated reminders that personal safety depended on usefulness. Childbearing carried obvious risk in a world without modern medicine, and the pressure to secure an heir could transform marriage into a sustained ordeal. A woman who failed to conceive, bore daughters rather than sons, or became politically inconvenient could be marginalized, blamed, or replaced. The language of chroniclers often describes these outcomes in moral terms, but the underlying mechanics were structural. Reproductive labor was part of governance. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to portray noble women only as passive victims. Some used the very systems that constrained them to carve out influence. Court correspondence, patronage records, and testamentary documents show that elite women could negotiate dowries, secure retainers, sponsor religious foundations, and shape succession disputes from inside the marital household. Yet even these forms of agency existed within strict boundaries. A woman could exercise influence because the system needed her to. Her leverage came from her place in a political marriage, not from freedom outside it. When she succeeded, she was often celebrated as prudent or pious. When she resisted or disrupted the dynastic plan, she could be recast as disobedient, dangerous, or disloyal. Documentary record therefore reveals a difficult truth about medieval power. Political marriage was not merely a social custom. It was a tool of rule. For noblewomen, forced marriage could function as a sentence handed down not by a courtroom alone, but by family council, diplomatic necessity, and dynastic anxiety. The punishment was the narrowing of selfhood into state function. Their names entered chronicles beside treaties and successions, yet their own desires rarely survive in equal measure. What does survive is the pattern itself. A medieval world in which elite women were bound into marriages that stabilized empires while limiting their freedom, and where the private life of a noblewoman was often one more arena in which power made its claim. Historical records become especially revealing when political marriages failed to produce the outcomes rulers expected. In many medieval courts, the noblewoman forced into a dynastic union occupied a precarious position because her value was tied not to permanence but to usefulness. Marriage could transform a princess into a queen, duchess, consort, or diplomatic intermediary, yet that status remained conditional. Chroniclers noted repeatedly that favor in aristocratic households shifted with military fortunes, succession disputes, fertility, and factional politics. A woman sent into marriage for peace could quickly become expendable once that peace no longer served political priorities. Among the aristocracies of medieval Europe, widowed noblewomen often faced a second cycle of coercion. Widowhood did not necessarily restore independence. Surviving legal agreements suggest that many widows, particularly those possessing land or inheritance rights, became immediate targets for remarriage negotiations. Their estates represented political leverage, and controlling their next marriage often meant controlling territory itself. Kings and feudal lords frequently intervened in the marriages of widowed heiresses because land ownership and military obligation were inseparable. Women who resisted remarriage could face financial penalties, confiscation of property, or political isolation. Legal customs in some regions even allowed rulers to sell or assign marriage rights over noble widows to favored allies, effectively turning aristocratic marriage into an extension of patronage politics. This practice reveals an important distinction in medieval punishment. Noblewomen were not always punished through spectacular violence. More commonly, punishment appeared through confinement, dependency, and strategic deprivation. A resistant woman might be placed under household supervision, restricted in travel, or denied access to allies. Monastic life occasionally became a refuge, but it could also function as coercion. Contemporary accounts describe women entering convents under circumstances that appear politically pressured rather than voluntary. Religious enclosure removed a noblewoman from succession disputes and prevented politically inconvenient remarriage. Once enclosed, opportunities for re-entry into political life were limited. While convents sometimes offered literacy, status, and administrative influence, they could equally serve dynastic interests by neutralizing women considered troublesome or politically sensitive. The experience of royal daughters exchanged between kingdoms further illustrates how political marriage could resemble displacements. Foreign brides frequently entered courts where language, ritual, and loyalties differed sharply from those of their birth families. Historical correspondence suggests that isolation itself could become a mechanism of control. A noblewoman might arrive accompanied by a small retinue, only to see trusted attendants gradually dismissed or replaced. A communication with natal relatives could be monitored or delayed. In unfamiliar courts, influence depended on producing heirs and securing allies quickly, often in environments where rival factions viewed foreign queens with suspicion. Court chronicles from medieval kingdoms repeatedly portray foreign noblewomen as symbols of instability during political crises. When wars erupted between their birth family and marital dynasty, their loyalty came under question regardless of personal conduct. Chroniclers sometimes accused queens of secret sympathies or political manipulation, with little evidence beyond family association. Such accusations could carry severe consequences. Noblewomen suspected of political disloyalty risked confinement, loss of ceremonial authority, or exclusion from governance. Even queens could experience a form of political captivity while technically retaining rank. The experience of women married across imperial frontiers in Eurasia reflects similar patterns. Diplomatic marriages between neighboring empires often sought to stabilize volatile borders. Among steppe confederations, imperial states, and frontier kingdoms, elite women could act as symbolic guarantees of peace. Yet surviving diplomatic sources indicate that these arrangements were fragile. If agreements collapsed, the woman at the center of the alliance occupied an especially vulnerable position. Her marriage represented a failed political project. In some cases, widowed or abandoned noblewomen were compelled into secondary marriages intended to repair damaged relations or preserve influence. The woman's personal continuity mattered less than the continuity of diplomacy. In the medieval Byzantine sphere, imperial women sometimes experienced an especially formalized version of political containment. Palace life was regulated by ceremonial hierarchy and strict etiquette, and noblewomen associated with losing factions often disappeared from political visibility with remarkable speed. Chroniclers described exiles to monasteries, removals from court, and enforced retirement from public life. While such actions could be framed as honorable withdrawal, historians frequently interpret them as methods of political management. Noblewomen connected to failed marriages, unsuccessful succession claims, or disgraced relatives became liabilities in a system where legitimacy depended heavily on symbolic order. The consequences of infertility reveal another dimension of punishment embedded within political marriage. Medieval dynastic systems relied heavily on biological succession, and noblewomen carried disproportionate responsibility for securing heirs despite limited medical understanding of reproduction. Court narratives often blamed women for childlessness regardless of male fertility or broader health conditions. Queen or noble consort who failed to produce surviving sons could experience declining influence, public humiliation, or replacement through annulment or secondary marriage arrangements. Legal records and ecclesiastical disputes from medieval Europe reveal repeated arguments surrounding annulments justified by political convenience. While religious authorities formally regulated marriage, rulers often sought legal avenues to dissolve unions that no longer served dynastic objectives. Noblewomen caught inside such disputes faced uncertainty over legitimacy, inheritance, and social standing. Even when annulments preserved outward dignity, the personal consequences could be severe. Repudiated noblewoman might return to her natal family carrying political embarrassment that weakened her future influence. In some instances, daughters born from contested marriages found their inheritance questioned, extending the effects of dynastic conflict across generations. Childbirth itself added another layer to the lived reality of forced political marriages. Historical demographic evidence indicates that elite women endured repeated pregnancies under significant physical danger. Mortality during childbirth remained high, and noble women often experienced pressure to conceive repeatedly until a politically secure male line emerged. Surviving letters and court accounts occasionally reveal exhaustion, illness, and emotional strain, though medieval sources rarely frame such experiences in explicitly personal language. Instead, suffering appears indirectly through reports of illness, interrupted ceremonies, or succession anxiety. In many courts, noble women also served as intermediaries between rival political factions. Queen or duchess might advocate for relatives, negotiate pardons, sponsor religious institutions, or distribute patronage. Yet these responsibilities carried risks. If a political faction lost power, association with it could threaten the woman's position. Chroniclers frequently judged politically active noble women harshly, portraying assertiveness as manipulation or ambition. The same political behavior admired in male nobles could become grounds for criticism when exercised by women. Historical interpretation increasingly suggests that accusations against politically influential noble women often reflected broader anxieties about legitimacy and authority rather than objective misconduct. The household itself functioned as an instrument of surveillance. Noble women rarely lived in privacy as modern audiences might imagine. Aristocratic households contained attendants, clerics, tutors, servants, guards, and political observers whose loyalties varied. Marital conflict, illness, infertility, and private grievances frequently became matters of public discussion because court life blurred distinctions between domestic and political space. Surviving administrative records indicate that noble women's expenditures, visitors, movements, and correspondence could be closely observed. Isolation was rarely complete, yet freedom was equally limited. Perhaps the deepest punishment embedded within political marriage lay in uncertainty. A noble woman's security depended on conditions she could not fully control. The survival of children, the favor of husbands, the fortunes of relatives, military outcomes, religious approval, and factional politics. One diplomatic shift could transform a respected queen into a suspect outsider. One succession crisis could erase decades of influence. Medieval political systems rewarded continuity, but tolerated abrupt reversals, leaving elite women exposed to forces far larger than individual preference. Yet despite these constraints, many noble women endured with remarkable adaptability. Surviving evidence shows women preserving family networks through letters, acting as estate managers during wartime absences, funding religious communities, and quietly shaping diplomacy behind ceremonial appearances. Their resilience should not obscure the coercive structures surrounding them, but it complicates any portrayal that sees them only through victimhood. The medieval noblewoman forced into political marriage often lived inside contradiction, elevated in status yet constrained in freedom, politically significant yet personally vulnerable, honored publicly while privately subjected to expectations that could become a lifelong burden. In some cases, the final stage of punishment for noble women forced into political marriages emerged not during marriage itself, but after political usefulness had faded. Medieval courts rarely provided stable protection for women whose dynastic value diminished. Once a husband died, a succession dispute emerged, or an alliance collapsed. The same systems that had elevated noble women could rapidly reduce their authority. Historical records indicate that many elite women spent their later years negotiating diminished influence, uncertain protection, and carefully managed visibility. A noblewoman who had once symbolized peace between rival powers could become politically inconvenient if relations deteriorated. Contemporary accounts describe widowed queens and aristocratic consorts being relocated to estates, monasteries, or secondary residences far from centers of power. Such arrangements were often presented in official language as honorable retirement or religious devotion. Yet surviving documents suggest that these removals frequently carried political purposes. Distance reduced a woman's ability to intervene in succession disputes, organize allies, or support rival claimants. The experience of dowager queens demonstrates how fragile noble status could become. In many medieval kingdoms, Queen Mother retained ceremonial dignity, but depended heavily on her relationship with sons or successors. If political factions considered her influential or threatening, access to court could narrow considerably. Chroniclers occasionally recorded accusations of interference or favoritism directed toward royal women who whose political involvement exceeded what male elites considered acceptable. Even respected noblewomen had to navigate shifting expectations carefully, balancing influence with caution. Throughout medieval Eurasia, noblewomen linked to defeated dynasties often faced especially difficult circumstances. When kingdoms changed rulers through conquest or rebellion, women associated with previous regimes could lose lands, household authority, or personal freedom. In some instances, marriage itself became a method of absorbing defeated aristocracies into new political systems. A widow or daughter from a rival house might be compelled into another strategic union, effectively extending the cycle of political obligation. Legal language framed such arrangements as settlements or alliances, but for many women, the outcome meant renewed displacement and reduced autonomy. Historical evidence also reveals quieter forms of endurance. Noblewomen frequently turned toward religious patronage as both survival strategy and source of legitimacy. Monasteries, charitable foundations, and devotional projects offered ways to maintain influence even after political setbacks. Surviving charters show aristocratic women funding churches, commissioning manuscripts, or supporting religious communities. Such patronage strengthened reputation and occasionally provided protection against political hostility. Religion could offer genuine devotion, but it also served practical functions in societies where moral standing shaped political credibility. The emotional realities of these experiences remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty because medieval sources rarely centered women's inner lives. Chroniclers tended to describe marriages through diplomacy, inheritance, or morality, rather than personal suffering. Yet fragments survive in letters, wills, legal petitions, and household records that hint at isolation, negotiation, and persistence. Foreign noblewoman requesting trusted attendance, a widowed queen defending property rights, or an aristocratic mother petitioning for her children's inheritance all reveal individuals navigating systems designed largely without their consent. The punishment of noblewomen forced into political marriages therefore cannot be understood only through moments of visible coercion. It operated through institutions, dynastic planning, inheritance law, diplomatic necessity, household surveillance, and expectations surrounding fertility and obedience. Power rarely needed constant violence when dependence itself could secure compliance. Marriage became both political contract and personal condition, one capable of shaping nearly every aspect of a woman's existence. What survives in the historical record is not only evidence of restriction, but also evidence of adaptation. Noblewomen lived within systems that constrained them, yet many learned to negotiate influence wherever opportunities appeared. Their stories reveal a medieval political order built not solely through warfare and kingship, but through households, alliances, and the lives of women whose marriages quietly helped sustain empires, while often limiting the freedom of the individuals at their center.